So welcome to Equity Matters. My name is Bob Bifulco, Director of PEEPs, the PEEPs program at Syracuse University. Today's guests are Drs. Ying Shi and Maria Zhu. Dr. Shi is an assistant professor at the Public Administration, and Maria is an assistant professor of economics, both at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. And both are researchers at the Center for Policy Research. They have been doing super interesting work together on racial and ethnic bias among teachers that they will be talking about today on the podcast. Thanks for joining us, Ying and Maria.
It's great to be here.
Thanks, Bob. It's great to be here.
So at the heart of this work you're doing on teacher bias is the unique data from North Carolina that allow you to develop pretty convincing measures of teacher bias. I was wondering if you can start by telling us a little bit about that data and talk about the measures of bias that you've developed using this data.
Yeah, definitely. So as you mentioned, in this project, we're using administrative data from North Carolina on all public school students in the state. And in North Carolina, students in 3rd grade through 8th grade take standardized tests in math and reading at the end of each school year. One interesting aspect of this setting is that teachers are also asked to assess their students on achievement in math and reading along the same criteria that the standardized tests are designed to measure. And so these teacher assessments are also collected at the end of the year, but they're collected before teachers get a chance to see how their students performed on the standardized tests. And so the way that we're measuring bias in this paper then is to look at whether teachers systematically differ in their assessments of Asian students compared to white students with the same standardized test scores who are in the same classroom. We're also accounting for things like differences in students' behavior that could perhaps influence teachers' judgments using measures like a student's absences as well as their disciplinary referral history. So basically, the idea is if we have an Asian student and a white student who are in the same classroom and who receive the same scores on their standardized tests, in the absence of bias, we would expect that the teacher would then give these two students the same assessment score, right? Because this is the same teacher and these students perform the same on their standardized tests. So then we define bias as a systematic difference in the ways that teachers assess academically comparable students of different races, where academic comparability is measured by standardized test performance. And the idea is, a priori, this bias could go in a positive or a negative direction, depending on whether teachers tend to assess Asian students at a higher or a lower academic achievement level compared to academically comparable white peers.
Great. So yeah, I mean, I personally have found these measures pretty convincing and set up a lot of opportunities for interesting work. So you have an earlier paper with another colleague that focuses on teacher bias towards Black students relative to white students. Can you tell us a little bit about what you find in that paper?
Yeah, absolutely. So that paper is with my collaborator, Marcos Rangel, who's at Duke University. And the paper opens up by looking at Black-white differences in teacher assessments. And when you look at, a Black and white student who are in the same classroom, who have the same standardized test scores, whether or not teachers assess Black students lower in terms of math and reading ability compared to their white peers. And Maria has given a thorough and thoughtful overview of sort of the data that we're using. It's essentially using the same underlying North Carolina microdata, focusing on elementary teachers. And so we do show in that paper with Marcos that Black students are rated lower than otherwise observationally equivalent white students. But really, the bulk of that paper is then sort of pivoting towards this question of, how does this sort of bias, this negative bias against Black students sort of come to be, right? What is sort of the origin of this bias? There's a lot of work or more work now looking at racial differentials in teacher judgment, but less so looking at the inception, right, of these racial differentials. And so our hypothesis in that paper is that first impressions matter, which is to say in that context, when novice teachers step into a classroom for the first time, the particular context of those initial classrooms, the racial compositions of those classrooms, and how well students in each racial group do vis-a-vis the other really matters, and it has persistent effects. And so what we find is that when novice teachers are in a classroom with Black students that on average perform less well than their white peers in the same classroom, the same teachers 1 to 3 years down the road are effectively imposing a penalty on future cohorts of Black students, even though those Black students might be performing the same as their white peers in those classrooms. So it's sort of this assessment penalty that's inflicted on Black students that we can trace back empirically to the context of their early classroom, these novice teachers' early classrooms. And the persistence of this first impression is very specific, right, to the early classroom context. So racial differentials in the first classroom carries over to the ways in which teachers differentially judge Black and white students in later classrooms, but not when it comes to judging, for example, boys and girls. So it doesn't carry over to the gender side and vice versa. We furthermore find that the intersection of race and gender, so for example, if there are gender-specific racial gaps, right, in those early classrooms, that has persistent effects on gender-specific racial assessment gaps 1 to 3 years down the road. And so the persistence is seen in a variety of contexts. And one other thing I should mention that I think is really maybe a little bit disheartening about what we find in that paper is the asymmetry. And so what I mean by that is that teachers seem to pay a lot of attention to what's going on in the lower tail of the performance distribution. So let's say you're a first-time teacher, and then you have a low-performing Black student in your classroom, and that seems to result in these penalties, assessment penalties later on for future cohorts of Black students. But we don't observe a symmetric effect when you have a Black superstar student in your early classroom. We're not seeing that teachers update accordingly or symmetrically when these high-achieving Black students are the students they face for the first time. And so there's a sense in which these sort of stereotype, maybe conforming Black students are really leaving those lasting impressions and potentially exacerbating racial inequality when it comes to teacher assessments, but there's not that kind of correcting mechanism when teachers are exposed to a really high-performing Black student.
Yeah, that's what really struck me about that earlier paper is kind of the suggestion that, consistent with what we know about the human mind, information that conforms to stereotypes, right, we tend to hold on to, whereas we dismiss or forget about information that doesn't conform to the stereotypes we bring. And I agree, probably a little disheartening as well. So now tell us a little bit more about your recent work on teacher perceptions of Asian students. What questions are you trying to address with this work?
Yeah, so we're looking at a few different research questions in this paper. First and foremost, we're looking to address whether teachers do in fact display biases in their assessment of Asian American students, which was an open question before this study. So furthermore, conditional on finding evidence of bias, we also want to quantify the direction and the magnitude of this bias. So that's kind of the main overarching question. Second, though, we're also looking at whether these biases towards Asian students differ by ethnic subgroups. And the idea here is Asian Americans are often lumped in together as one category and treated as an aggregate group when it comes to policy considerations. However, we want to highlight that Asians are a heterogeneous group in terms of their immigration histories, circumstances, and timelines, which has led to different subgroups having very different experiences in the US. And so one of the goals of this paper is to shed light on whether this has differentially affected perceptions and experiences of these various subgroups. And the third question that we're looking at is whether there are spillover effects of teachers' biases towards Asian students on other groups of minority students. So this is kind of a spoiler alert, but in our main analysis, we do find that teachers are more positive in their assessments of Asian students than they are white students with the same test scores. And so one concern here is that these positive stereotypes that teachers display towards Asian students, one concern is that these biases may reinforce the notion of fundamental differences across groups or bolster teachers' negative stereotypes for other underrepresented minority groups, kind of going back to what you were saying, Bob, about, reinforcing kind of the stereotypes that we already have in place in our minds.
Great. So you already started to talk a little bit about the findings, but I was wondering if there was more you might want to say about the findings in this paper.
So I can add a little bit more to that. So as Maria already mentioned, that we find a positive bias for Asian Americans in the context of this paper, and I'll just add that the magnitude of those, I guess the positive teacher assessments for Asian students who are observationally equivalent to their white peers in the same classrooms, the magnitudes are at least as large, usually even larger than the sort of negative bias that we can quantify for Black and Hispanic students in this vis-a-vis white students in those classrooms. And to Maria's point about, we see a lot of times, for example, in popular media, Asian Americans are kind of like viewed as this monolithic group. So we were really interested in sort of taking a step kind of deeper into all of the subcategories of Asian Americans. And what we find is that the extent of positive bias is larger for Asian students in our sample who we characterize as East Asian or South Asian based on their home languages. And so you can think of these students as very likely those students are or have, these are students potentially with families from China, Japan, South Korea, for example, as well as India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. And then compared to students from Southeast Asian countries. And so these would be, for example, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, Cambodia, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so there's within the Asian group, just a lot of heterogeneity in terms of how large this bias is. And then turning to the second part of this paper, which is really, as Maria mentioned, thinking about spillover effects. So we don't really look at consequences of this positive bias for Asian Americans in the context of this paper, but we do look at sort of short-term effects when there is a single Asian student in the classroom. Like, how does that matter, or does it not matter for the ways in which teachers assess other underrepresented minority groups, so Black and Hispanic students relative to their white peers? And the richness of this data really allows us to kind of construct, I guess, or isolate these contexts whereby whether or not there's a single Asian student in the classroom is plausibly kind of random. So it's just like these localized little experiments where classrooms are broadly similar, but some have one Asian student in them and others don't. And when there's a classroom with an Asian student, it appears that the sort of the gaps in teacher assessments, the Black, white, and Hispanic white gaps, and these are negative biases towards these students, marginalized students, are getting larger, right? I think in the paper we say about a quarter larger. I mean, there's a range there, but we're looking at accentuated teacher assessment gaps for Black and Hispanic students when in the presence of an Asian student. And so obviously that begs the question of, is it something about Asian identity in particular, or is it something about the correlates of Asian students, right? So they're oftentimes, in the North Carolina context, oftentimes they're higher achieving and sometimes higher SES. And so we do dive into this in the paper as well. And we do find that, for example, this effect, for example, is sometimes concentrated when it comes to exposure to an Asian student who's quite high achieving. And so is this something particular to Asian students? Well, we look at this by seeing what happens when classrooms are similarly exposed to a single Black student or Hispanic student who's high achieving. And so for example, exposure to a high achieving Black student doesn't do anything to the ways in which teachers assess fellow Hispanic students, right? So we provide some additional evidence in the paper that the patterns of results that we observe are very much specific to Asian students. Right? Doesn't necessarily mean that it's only Asian identity that matters, but it could be the combination of Asian identity and all the correlates of race in this particular context. But there's certainly something unique going on with Asian students that we wanted to underscore.
Yeah, that's one of the things I really appreciate about the work you're doing. First, it's important to document these types of biases, and your data allow you to do that. in ways that aren't always available. But also then trying to understand the kind of the complex social processes by which these biases emerge, get reinforced, and get strengthened. So next, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the importance of your finding, both here and in the earlier work we talked about. And how should people in school systems respond to your findings?
So Maria and I, we think there's potentially several implications. So in terms of the importance of of our findings, and also with regard to the findings from the other paper, the fact that we're showing these racial differences in teacher assessments, whether it's Asian white or Black white gaps, right? It matters because, well, teachers are an integral part of, right, the system that kind of shepherds students along in whatever academic trajectory that they take, right? Teachers play a role, for example, in shepherding students through gifted and talented programs and other academic tracks. So teacher judgments and expectations matter in that way. There's also now a small but growing literature showing that teacher expectations are self-fulfilling prophecies, right? The so-called Pygmalion or Rosenthal effect. So I think Andrew Hill and Daniel Jones, as well as Nick Papageorge, Seth Gershenson and co-authors, they have nice papers on this, right? Showing empirically that students might, change their investments in their own human capital based on what they perceive their teacher expectations to be. And so students might disinvest, right, if a Black student perceives that teacher expectations are lower. And so these expectations really are potentially a very important input into how well students fare. And then I think our work also kind of underscores the extent to which, kind of you alluded to this, Bob, the sort of the classroom context, these sort of nuanced classroom contexts might matter. Just the presence, for example, of a single Asian student, right, can have all of these consequences. And also this pointing out that sort of, this positive evaluation bias for Asian students might just be the other side of the same coin, right? You have these negative biases, and these fundamental differences that Maria was mentioning are really underscored when there's the presence of an Asian student. So in terms of what I guess school administrators or kind of policymakers can take away, I mean, I guess one of the things that we would point out is that perhaps there could be things done, maybe even in professional development context, just to raise awareness, for example, of some of these issues. So I think Alessina et al. Has a paper showing that, teachers who are made aware of their implicit biases, I think this is in the Italian context, so somewhat different, but still potentially relevant here. They change, for example, their assessments of immigrant students relative to non-immigrant students. And so there could be a way in which just informing teachers of their potential to make these, to kind of racially, kind of based on race, differentially evaluate students could nudge them to changing their behavior. And then, and this is, true in both cases, but thinking about, like, for example, in the paper with Marcos, that initial allocation of teacher to classrooms, right, to the extent it's random, but just thinking about, when there is, let's say, a Black student in the classroom whose performance is a little bit, stereotype conforming, that could have negative consequences down the road. So thinking more deliberately about the types of classrooms, particularly novice teachers stepped into, would be worthwhile.
Terrific. So maybe to get even a little more specific, one of the things that we hope to do in this podcast is to kind of bring it home for listeners in the Syracuse area. So as you know, the Syracuse area is typical of many metropolitan areas in the Northeast with considerable amounts of racial and ethnic diversity, including large immigrant populations from places like the Sudan and Burma, in the city schools at least. Also high levels of racial segregation across school districts, concentrations of poverty in the central city, and large achievement gaps between various groups of students. So are there any implications of your work and findings for the education in the Syracuse area?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think Syracuse is a good example of a context where our findings have some important implications. So as you mentioned, Syracuse is a very diverse city, racially and ethnically. We're also a very big refugee receiving city. One implication of our findings is the importance of recognizing the role of this diversity of backgrounds in shaping students' experiences, as well as the perceptions that they're receiving from other people and how that shapes their trajectories. In particular, our subgroup results highlight the value of not lumping different groups of students together, as this can mask differences in underlying experiences. For example, just because two students both come from refugee backgrounds or their families come from the same continent doesn't necessarily mean they're subject to the same types of biases from society. And so we shouldn't necessarily view them through the same homogenous framework. And the fact that there are large achievement gaps between different groups of students in Syracuse, going back to something that Ying mentioned, I think further highlights the importance of being cognizant of and addressing teachers' biases, given that we do have research now showing that teachers' expectations matter, right? Sometimes they essentially function as self-fulfilling prophecies. They also, right, affect things like teachers' recommendations for, what type of academic track a student is on or things like that. And so given that there are already large disparities racially and ethnically in this area, and that we know that, these biases can be, self-fulfilling and exacerbating, I think that's something to be even more aware of moving forward. Finally, I think our research also shows that biases are context specific, so we should definitely take that into consideration as well when trying to understand how racial and ethnic identities affect perceptions of students. For example, when we're thinking about differences in student demographic makeup in central city areas and versus suburban areas or more rural areas. So for example, in North Carolina, like in Syracuse, we find that student demographics in the central city versus non-central city areas do differ significantly. And we find in North Carolina that teacher biases also look different in city versus non-city areas, suggesting that differences in student composition in terms of socio-demographic characteristics by racial and ethnic groups across schools also affects biases and perceptions. And that's something that we should be aware of in other settings as well.
Terrific, thanks. So what's next for you guys on this line of work? Are there further questions that you're looking to pursue, and what's next?
Great question. So as with any research project, right, we might have answered some of our initial questions, but it always kind of spurs additional ones. And I would say Maria and I certainly have got quite a few of those, and are excited to kind of move forward and to start to think about them and invite kind of other collaborators working in these similar areas to kind of be our interlocutors, and so that we can maybe collaborate. So kind of immediately from this work on Asian Americans, we looked at kind of near-term effects and consequences for students of color, right? Other students of color in the same classrooms, but we didn't look at the consequences for Asian students themselves. And so that's certainly kind of one direction that we could go is to look at maybe even longer term consequences for those Asian students. And to go back to this recurrent theme of Asian students are not monolithic, it would be really interesting, right, to kind of better understand to what extent these types of stereotypical expectations in some ways from teachers might differentially affect students who conform to those expectations. What about Asian students, for example, that are not kind of typically like achieving highly, at least in conventional terms, right? And this certainly expands to beyond Asian students, right? So if you think about Black students, right? Black students who are high achieving, right? Who maybe do not fit neatly into our stereotype priors. How do these types of expectations affect them differentially than Black students that might kind of affirm whatever stereotypes we all have? And so that's kind of one direction. And then of course there's a whole set of questions around the inception of these biases. And so Marcos and I, we had looked at something that was sort of early career for teachers, but these sort of prejudices and beliefs are shaped throughout individuals' lifetimes. And so you can even think about looking at sort of pre-labor market factors, what's going on post-secondary, and things like that. So really kind of tracing back and trying to understand what, or maybe even, teachers' own educational experiences growing up, right? So I'm just a little bit brainstorming here, but what are sort of the contexts and environments in which that might give rise to some of these behaviors that we see. And then there's more of a general thought. So Maria and I are obviously, so this is a paper largely on Asian Americans. We're very interested in topics in this area. So Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial and ethnic group in the United States. But we both have this feeling that sometimes when we're reading research papers in particular, we're looking at disparities, let's say between white students or white individuals and, Black or Hispanic individuals. And Asians are not really part of the picture, or a little bit, there's not enough information. And so just, trying to build out a research program that really is focusing on that group and the sort of challenges that are faced by that group in particular. And Asian Americans are increasingly, I guess, in the news. So, when you hear about issues like race, affirmative action in both the sort of post-secondary context, as well as when it comes to selective secondary schools. So that's, one thing that's going on. Obviously, with the COVID-19 pandemic, we hear a lot about hate crimes against Asian Americans in particular that are highly salient. And so you could, also think about what are the consequences of at least just even hearing about these hate crimes, right? Not only for the victims themselves, but potentially for whole communities of Asian Americans when they're exposed to such incidents. How does that affect, the ways in which they engage, either civically or in other ways? And so certainly there's no shortage of questions for this line of research. And I would say that, Maria and I are excited to move forward, and we very much hope that we can come back with exciting research updates in the coming months and years.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more that, as important as it is to document these types of biases, which is I think a big contribution here, thinking about the processes by which they emerge and by which the consequences of those biases are realized is what we really need to focus on if we're going to try to improve things. So I appreciate all the work you guys are doing. So thank you for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us about the fascinating work you're doing. And I wish you luck as you move forward with this work.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. This is great.
Thanks, Bob. It's been a pleasure.
Great. Thanks a lot. Thanks to our listeners for joining us for this episode of Equity Matters. We encourage you to visit the Program for Educational Equity and Policy website at educational-equity.org. There you'll find working papers, policy briefs, a blog, and other products to inform your own research, help with your courses on educational policy, and guide you through complex educational policy issues. And if you enjoyed the podcast, please share it with your friends and tweet about it. Finally, look for future episodes of Equity Matters on our website and on the whatever platforms you use to find your favorite podcast. Thank you for listening to Equity Matters.